Letters from Spain. Letter 13. Cultural comparison. Hello! Yet another week has gone by. This time of year always seems to go by so quickly, maybe just because it's pretty uneventful. There's nothing special to report in February. We have Valentine's Day, I guess, but there's no holiday for Valentine's Day. The weather, well, actually, even though the weather normally is pretty bad in February and quite bad in New York in February, here in Madrid has been pretty good. Quite almost concerningly good. It was up in the 60s or up to 17 or 18 degrees Celsius. So, that could also be a cause for concern if you're concerned about the environment. But I'm just going to enjoy it. Meanwhile, in America, Trump has been acquitted. So the impeachment is a farce. The Iowa caucus also is a farce. And apparently we're all going to die of coronavirus soon. So I'm just going to enjoy the sunny February weather. Today, I'm going to try to do a kind of high-level cultural comparison between the two countries I know best, Spain and the United States. Of course, I constantly compare these two places on my podcast. That's pretty much what I'm here to do. But, most cultural comparisons, just in general in life, focus on the details. They focus on the diet, on fashion, rituals, and so on. Spanish people eat dinner at 9 o'clock. Americans eat dinner at 7 o'clock. Well, culture goes a lot deeper than that. And if you really want to get to the heart of cultural differences, you got to try to focus on more fundamental values. This guy, Geert Hofstede, I'm not sure I'm saying his name right, he's from the Netherlands, developed perhaps the most famous framework for comparing cultures. Basically, what Hofstede did was to break down a culture into 6 independent variables and then to measure them on a scale of 0 to 100. Well, so I don't really know how far I agree with his theory or methodology, but I think that Hofstede's framework is at least a good place to start if you want to get to comparing cultures. Specifically in this podcast, I want to focus on what Hofstede calls power distance. And this is the degree to which a society accepts a hierarchy as legitimate. So in other words, you could think of this as the difference in respect granted to a boss and an employee. You respect a boss more than you respect an employee, or you respect a parent more than you respect a child. We regard these differences as legitimate. But cultures differ in the degree to which they accept power differences as legitimate and right. So, according to the Hofstede consultancy website, now there's a whole consultancy firm based on his theory, Spain scores significantly higher than the United States in this measure, meaning that it's a less egalitarian culture. But I have serious doubts about this. Much of the data that Hofstede collected was collected in the 1970s, so I think Spain might have still been a dictatorship at that time or was just coming out of the dictatorship. And the data focused exclusively on IBM employees. Basically, Hofstede worked for IBM, and he realized that IBM had offices all over the world, and so this would be a good place to start if you wanted to compare cultures. So anyway, I'm prepared to argue that in Spain nowadays, on the whole, power distance is a lot lower than in America. That is to say that Spain is more egalitarian in spirit. And a lot of things lead me to this conclusion. An obvious clue is the Spanish language itself, actually. Spanish, in case you didn't know, has 2 forms to say you. A casual version, tú, and a formal version, usted. So in Spain, the usted form is rarely used, actually. Even when you meet a total stranger or you're in a shop, it's expected to use the casual tu when you're speaking. To be honest, I've used the usted form so rarely that I'm not even good at using it. Now, this is not the case in many Latin American cultures, where they actually do use the usted form quite frequently. And a few decades ago, it wasn't the case in Spain either. So the language itself has, for the most part, stopped encoding differences in respect. Now, you use the casual version of address even when you're talking to your boss, which is interesting to me. Another striking piece of evidence of Spain's egalitarianism is how teachers are addressed in the classroom. In America, as in many countries, teachers are called by their last name. So I would be Mr. Lotz. But in Spain, teachers are universally called by their first names. So here I'm just Roy to my students. I'm not even Mr. Roy or Teacher Roy. I'm just Roy. And I don't think this is just a curious fact. Believe me, the relationship between students and teachers is very different in Spain than in the United States. Growing up, I remember seeing my teachers as unquestioned authority figures. Someone to disobey at your own risk, even though I often did disobey, admittedly. In Spain, students just don't have this fear of teachers like I had in America. There is a definite and very noticeable casualness in the relationship between students and teachers that can really drive you crazy if you're trying to quiet down a class. Students don't automatically respect you. Now, here's another example from the classroom. And obviously, I'm a teacher, so this is where most of my experience is. In American high schools, there's a definite hierarchy among the students. There's a continuum from the cool, popular kids to the uncool, unpopular kids. I mean, think of any American movie about high school you've seen. Or if you are American, think about your own high school experience. And there are also quite noticeable cliques and groups of students in any given American classroom. Certain people hang together. In Spain, these factors are pretty refreshingly absent. At least from my perspective or my experience observing a lot of Spanish classrooms, there's no definite hierarchy of popular to unpopular students, and all the students mix pretty freely. Girls and boys, just everyone really. So most of the time, you could randomly group students together without fearing them having any issues working together. And that's quite nice. There are other signs of this cultural trait too, of egalitarianism. One thing striking for an American is how rarely Spanish people talk about their jobs. In America, your job is one of the first things we ask about a person when we meet them, and we kind of assume that a person's job defines them, at least partially. But in Spain, people don't often ask about your job, and in my experience, they never really want to talk about their work very much. If anything, they want to talk about their work as little as possible. So, now again, I don't think this is just a curious fact. In America, your job defines your role in a big hierarchy, the big hierarchy of America. And I think this is one of the main reasons that we want to know it when we meet someone, because our attitude can change, even if it changes somewhat subtly or unconsciously, if we know we're talking to a janitor or to a lawyer. If you're an American listening, try to imagine knowing someone for weeks and weeks without ever learning what their job was. Wouldn't that make you feel a little uncomfortable? So I also think that power distance is encoded into forms of politeness. Specifically, I think about the American tendency to say please and thank you sort of obsessively. Spanish people say please and thank you, of course, but not nearly so often or in nearly so many different situations. To me, this is a very telling fact. The words please and thank you are for making requests and receiving benefits. The fact that you have to say it implies that you're not owed anything by the other members of the group, and so every benefit you receive should be treated like a generous gift, even when it obviously isn't. In fact, you could really think about please and thank you as like verbal substitutes for payment, which is why when we're given something for free, we tend to say thank you sort of in an over the top way, as if we could sort of compensate for not actually paying it. So, well, that's an economic comparison for you. Another funny thing is that normally we say please and thank you when we're in situations when there really isn't a lot of choice. So we're thanking someone for doing something that they have no choice to do. For example, an American might say thank you when a worker in a restaurant fills up their glass with water, but of course, that worker didn't do so because, out of the generosity of their heart. They did so because if they didn't, they might get fired. Similarly, we say please when we're ordering in a restaurant, but we don't say it when we're asking our friend to pass us a beer. Sort of interesting, right? Well, my point is that these words, far from indicating a situation with equal power, are most often used when there's unequal power, such as when a boss is telling a worker what to do, or when you're ordering at a restaurant, and so on. Please and thank you, then, serve as a kind of respectful mask for unequal power distributions. They help make people feel better about unequal power. This is why, in some cultures, many cultures, inappropriately thanking someone can be seen as disrespectful. Even in Spain, if you impulsively thank your waiters in a restaurant for everything they do, take your order, give you a beer, serve you food, they might look at you funny. The attitude is that it's their job and they have to do it. You're paying for a service and receiving it, so what's with all this copious thanks? While I'm on the subject of Spanish restaurants, I think the attitude of waiters also illustrates an important cultural difference. To be a waiter in many American restaurants, you need to be an actor as well as a server. Waiters are expected to smile and be chipper and pleasant in America. In Spain, there really isn't nearly as much of a notion that waiters should take on this role so completely. And I think this applies to many jobs, not just waiters. Even while they're working, Spanish people tend to treat their jobs as jobs and not as roles in a play, not as things they have to embody. And this, to me, signals an unwillingness to identify with their level in the hierarchy of status, that is, the job market. They maintain their primary identity as independent of their temporary social role as a waiter or a teacher or whatever. So anyway, this, in short, or maybe not so short, is why I think Spain's culture has a lower score on the power distance scale than America. But while I'm on the subject of these big cultural differences, I thought I'd also mention another important way that cultures can differ: individualism versus communalism. A culture can value the group or can value the individual. As is often noted, the United States is highly individualistic. As a Western country, Spain is pretty individualistic too, in the grand scheme of things, though significantly less than America, I think. Here, again, I think that forms of politeness can give us a clue. While saying thank you and you're welcome are not as important in Spain as in the United States, it is significantly more important in Spain to say hello and goodbye. Spaniards take greetings seriously. When you're introduced to a group of people in the United States, you can just wave to everyone and just say, "Oh, hey guys." But in Spain, you need to make your way around the circle and individually shake the hands or kiss, depending if they're a boy or girl, every person. Similarly, you have to say goodbye. Technically, you say hasta luego, see you later, whenever you leave a space, even if you're just talking to perfect strangers and it's a completely communal space. And this applies to a lot of situations that can strike Americans as quite strange. So you walk into the staff room at your school where you work just because you need to pick up a pencil. And you say hola right when you enter, and when you go, you say hasta luego. In America, we wouldn't do that. Or you visit someone in a building that's not your building, and then as you leave, you say goodbye to the doorman, just very normally, hasta luego. Or even if you're in an elevator in a crowded office building full of people you don't know, when you leave the elevator, you say hasta luego. We would never ever do this in America. You leave an elevator, you say, "See you later," to a bunch of strangers. This strikes an American as really bizarre, but it makes sense in a more communal culture because being together in a group is a strong value in itself. You could even get a taste of this if you look at the two countries on Google Earth. Americans live alone in big houses separated by their lawns. Spaniards often live all bunched up together in apartment buildings. And even in rural areas, they bunch together in a big heap rather than spread out across the landscape. So when you're driving around Spain, you have miles and miles of just nothing. And then all of a sudden you get to the town where everyone is packed together. And then you drive through the town and then nothing and nothing and nothing again until the next town. This is how the landscape is divided. Spanish people love being together. As a last cultural aspect to consider, there's what Hofstede calls masculinity, which I think is a bad name for a useful concept. So the concept is, and I'm quoting here, the degree to which a society will be driven by competition, achievement, and success, end quote. But I think you could just call this competitiveness rather than masculinity. I don't really understand why labeling it masculine is helpful in any way. In America, life is conceived as a struggle of everyone against everyone, a universal rat race, a giant zero-sum game where there are winners and losers. Americans want to have high status, and there's only so much status to go around. Spanish culture is not nearly so competitive. You can see this pretty clearly if you teach high school. In America, even academic success is all ranked. We separate students into tracks, the normal classes, the honors classes, or the AP, advanced placement classes. And even within those classes, we rank them all on their grades from the best to worst. Not only that, but students in American high schools constantly scramble to accomplish as much as they can to boost their resumes. They try to get high grades. They engage in extracurriculars. They join all the groups in school, the clubs, or they do sports, music, dance, theater. They're just running around all over the place, trying to make themselves competitive. Your status depends on success in America. Your success depends on your money. And your money partly depends on your education. And your education depends on whether you can get into an elite university. And that depends on whether you can make your resume as impressive as possible. Spanish high schools are really not like this at all. They don't have official sports teams that compete against other high school sports teams. And also, the Spanish university system is completely different. It has none of that rat race quality that it does in America because there are enough spots for everyone who wants to go, and the universities aren't intensely expensive or intensely prestigious like they are in America. So I think you could see that Spain scores considerably lower on the competitive scale. And that means that in Spain, it's not about having the most status. It's more about just having kind of a good life, to put it in a nutshell, I think. To me, it's obvious that even if Hofstede intended these qualities to be independent variables that you could compare, they seem quite deeply interconnected to me. A culture that's more egalitarian will almost definitely be more communal and less competitive, and then vice versa for all those things. So anyway, this podcast has already gone on long enough, but I hope I at least gave you some food for thought about cultural differences. And I wasn't trying to argue that either one of these was better, by the way. In some cases, it's nice to have a low score on the power distance scale for people to be equal. But believe me, as a teacher, sometimes you really wish that there was more of a power difference between yourself and your students. Maybe they would listen to you. On the other hand, I think that competition to get into good colleges, as the example mentioned above, is really not a good thing in America. I don't think it's psychologically healthy, and I don't think it's socially healthy either. So, pick your poison, I guess. Thank you.